Hello and welcome to this lecture. We will look at the definition of the Kubernetes persistent volume for the REST API server. A Kubernetes pod runs one or more containers. If you do not specify a volume for your pod, then a container in the pod becomes ephemeral or stateless. This means that any changes to the container's file system are lost if the container crashes. If you want more consistent storage that is independent of the container, you can assign a volume to your pod. If you want to persist the state of your application beyond the lifetime of a pod, you can use a persistent volume PV for short and allocate this PV to your pod via a persistent volume claim PVC for short. A persistent volume PV is a piece of storage in the Kubernetes cluster that has a life cycle independent of any individual pod that uses the PV. There are several types of PVs, and each type has a different way of mounting the volume. We will use a PV of the type host path, where the volume is mounted to a path on the Kubernetes node host machine. Please note that this PV type should not be used on a production environment. A persistent volume claim PVC is an object that declares a specific storage need which can be satisfied by a matching PV. The Kubernetes cluster attempts to find a PV with the needed storage and binds it to the PVC. If a pod needs persistent storage, it defines a volume based on a PVC. Let's see how PVs and PVCs are managed in a Kubernetes cluster. An administrator of a Kubernetes cluster can create a pool of PVs to be made available for requesters that need storage. Each storage requester can create a PVC to specify the specs of the storage it needs. Kubernetes will then bind PVCs to PVs that match their specs, e.g. storage size. Let's look at how we use persistent volumes in our application. Check the definition of the PV and the PVC that we will use in the Fibonacci backend in the file backend_storage.yaml. The PV is defined in lines 1 to 14. Note the following properties in the definition. The storage capacity is specified as 1 GB, storage:1 GI. The access mode is specified as read-write once. This means that the volume can be mounted as read-write by a single node. It also allows multiple pods to access the volume when the pods are running on the same node, which is what we want. I use this host path. On a Windows machine running Docker desktop, this translates to a local path of c:\Fibonacci\logs. Change this path to the one you want to use on your host machine. The PVC is defined in lines 16 to 26. Note the following properties in the definition. The access mode is specified as read-write once. This makes it match the access mode on the PV we defined above. The storage request is 1 GB, which also matches the capacity of the PV. Now check how we use the PVC in our deployment in file backend_deployment_v3.yaml. I opened it side by side with the v2 of the deployment to make it easy to see the differences. We set the annotation to Fibonacci backend v3, which will appear in the deployment history when we apply this version of the deployment. The main differences start at line 26. We set the version to v3.0 and we also enable logging. Now let's look at how the persistence of data is happening. The pod spec defines the volume in lines 30 to 33, where it refers to the PVC Fibonacci backend PVC. It also mounts the volume at path /logs inside the container, See lines 27 to 29. This allows the REST API to write the logs to the default file path /logs/system.log. Check the REST API implementation, line 63 in api.py. To recap, now we have the deployment which creates a replica set, and the replica set creates 5 pods. All the pods are attached to one PVC, which is possible because all the pods run on the same Kubernetes node, and the PVC is bound to the PV. This way, any of the 5 pods can write to the log file which will be stored on the host machine. Let me reiterate that this PV type of host path should not be used in a production environment. That's it for this lecture. Head over to the next lab where you will persist the state of your application using a persistent volume.